Welcome everybody again to another Any Bites. Sorry we haven't had one for the last couple of months. It seems like everybody has been super busy, and everything's just overtaken everyone as normally happens. First couple of things, as usual, before we get started. Normal notes. The events page, anyone who wants to look back or to see what's coming, we use Tito, so that's ti.to any bytes. The Twitter handle there, and the email if anybody wants to send us any suggestions for talks like that. Our code of conduct, I'll remind you, is on the website there. And anybody with comments or suggestions, you can reach out to me or to Brett on Twitter, and we're happy to.
Cool. Right. Hope everyone can see everything. Yep. Awesome. So yeah, thank you for the intro. So I'm April Edwards. I'm a senior cloud advocate at Microsoft. I'm based here in the UK. So the really cool thing is if anyone needs anything, you can ping me on Twitter or LinkedIn, and I respond pretty quickly. I actually came from engineering. So I used to be build with, code with customers. And I was living and breathing DevOps along with automation and all sorts of stuff in the cloud, a lot of app transformation. And developer velocity is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I work on a team in the advocacy org that focuses on DevOps. And developer velocity is important because if we don't have velocity, we can't really do much, and we're stagnated in our organizations. And I think when we talk about developer velocity, we want to think about like what is our productivity, what's our community around us, and I think most importantly, especially during COVID, is our well-being. I can say that all of us have been impacted negatively in many ways and also positively, and it's been a time for developer velocity to accelerate. So when I give any kind of talk, I'm big on DevOps, and I always say to people like, how would you define DevOps? So what I'm going to do, since we're a small group, is welcome to come off mute and tell us what you think of DevOps. Like, how would you define it? If anyone's brave enough to come off mute, or you can put it in the chat. No one's brave. All right. But I think, if I were to sit with each and every one of you, I get a very different definition of DevOps. I'm going to play a video. I don't know if the sound's going to come through because I'm on Teams. Sometimes it comes through, sometimes it doesn't. The sound's not important. The video is. So we're going to go through and watch it. If you guys can't hear it, that's cool. So if I'm going to sit here quietly and look like, hopefully you can hear it. So I love this video. And the reason why I love this video is because this embraces DevOps. So let's think about your application stack. Let's think about the velocity and how we develop our applications today. When we look at that video, and I apologize if you guys didn't hear any sound, there were 4 people accessing that car. And think about your legacy apps where you might have 1, 2, 3, maybe only 4 people accessing that application. You go into your server space, you literally go to the physical server, plug something in, and deploy that application. And I've done it, and I'm sure there's lots of you out there that have done it. We've had to physically manipulate things on the server environment to make your application work. You had to tweak a few things, maybe to get something to run, and that was how we developed apps today. Now there's a lot more that goes into our applications, and there's multiple changes that have to be made to get an application running, and everyone wants in. So we have our development teams, we have our QA teams, production teams, DBAs, infrastructure folks. We have all these people that want to be involved in our application deployment. And that slows down our velocity, or it can, doesn't necessarily have to. And when we look at what developers have access to, most of the time they don't even have access to the apps and the servers, the servers that they're trying to deploy to. They rely on the operational team. So we've created these silos. So when we look at this race car, I mean, this emboldens what we're trying to do as developers. We have things today like infrastructure as code, CI/CD, automation. We can deliver software faster than ever before, and that's awesome. But there's a lot that goes into it. We have a lot of choices out there, but if you look at that first part of the video, they're using a physical hammer on that race car, and you had one guy doing multiple tasks, multiple jobs on that race car. Then we go look at this picture now, and one person has one task. And we've literally gone from using that physical hammer to using an air wrench. And that reflects into how our tools are today. We have a lot of automation tools that we're using. And let's look at this picture for a second. There is a guy standing over here literally doing nothing in this picture. He is looking how to make this pit stop even faster. His job is just to monitor and give that feedback to make that even faster for the next pit stop. And look at this guy in the far left of the screen that's holding a jack. There are 2 people with jacks because they know that jack is so critical to that race car getting out of that pit stop. They need a second one. He is literally just there for redundancy. So they're looking to protect themselves from failure and looking to iterate every single time. So I asked you in the beginning to define DevOps in your own words. And again, this all comes from, our own backgrounds, our experiences with DevOps. And whenever we engage with customers and talk about DevOps at Microsoft, we have a definition that we use. And we say that DevOps is the union of people, processes, and technologies to enable continuous delivery of value to our end users. And I want to focus on this word value because, we're trying to ship software or some kind of product or something else, but actually we're not. If we're delivering that value. And if we're not delivering value, we're really not delivering anything because it's about what's being consumed. It's what's being measured. And so we want to focus on that value. And I want you to keep that in mind as we kind of talk about developer velocity. And there's really these 3 pillars of DevOps: the people, the process, and the technologies. The people, that's the hardest part. And we're going to focus on the people today. We're going to talk a little bit about the processes and then move into the technologies. But one of these things on their own will not get us to be a high-performing organization and increase our velocity. We need to combine all 3 together. We need to get buy-in from the top of our organizations, tear that down. We need to deliver value. People in our teams need to have roles and not just jobs. And whether we're working in agile methodologies or Scrum, and I work with so many organizations that work in a waterfall methodology, that process needs to be refined. And when we talk about the tooling and the technologies, how do we automate things? How do we run testing? How do we check in our code? And these are really critical things. And I'm going to talk about how we do this at Microsoft and hopefully some good takeaways for you. So why is DevOps important? Why do I live and breathe DevOps? Because I came from the ops space. I moved into development. And I've lived and breathed so many painful things in my career. And DevOps is important because your competition's already doing it. I mean, how many of you remember going to a Blockbuster and checking out a physical VHS tape? I do. Well, now we have things like Netflix. And then we talk about the taxi industry here in the UK, especially in London and other major cities like Manchester and everything else. Uber's prominent because they're delivering what the customers want. And that's absolutely critical. And that's why these things are important to our organizations. And, we talk about theories of DevOps, but we have hard numbers to say high-performing organizations achieve more. And that's why Microsoft is so keen on developer velocity. Again, I talk about this being a 3-stage conversation. We need to talk about the people side, the process side, and the products. So we're going to touch on a little bit of that today because that all plays into developer velocity. DevOps is not magic, okay? It's hard and it's going to hurt. And when I work with a customer, we go in and we take the thing that hurts most and we do it more often. We take that big pain point in that organization. So when I was engaged with a customer previously, we would take an application stack or a problem they had that was pretty small, minute, but had a massive impact on the organization, had a lot of pain points, and that's what we attacked. And we start off with a shift left mentality when we engage with a customer. Now, if you haven't heard of shift left, that's cool. Think of it as early and often, and you want to fail fast. You want to learn and can constantly iterate your processes in an organization. In the shift left model, you put a lot of effort into that planning and design phase. You bring all those teams in early. It's bringing in all those people in an organization into that design piece in your planning phase. Then when you go to develop your code, you're spending your time addressing those issues then and there, because we know as soon as you ship that code to production, you're going to have a higher cost to resolve it, more issues in production, and obviously outages and other issues in the organization. So I want to talk about technical intensity. So Satya is our CEO. Hopefully everyone's heard of Satya Nadella. Tech intensity is about the people. And we have this formula where we talk about the tech adoption in our organizations multiplied by our capability. And that's exponentially controlled by trust. And Microsoft, has this phrase, we run on trust. And when we talk about technical intensity in our organizations, trust is really that underlying value that helps us exponentially drive the value in the organization. And I like to talk about this epic deployment, because again, we want to drive value and want to drive trust in our developers and our engineers in the organization. How many of you have been in this situation where you've, had to block out a bank holiday weekend, call in all the teams, and you have a deployment, whether it's patching an update to your application or something, you have this epic deployment and it is stressful and it sucks. Flat out, it sucks. You have individual experts in the team come in. It's a non-repeatable thing, but maybe once a year, twice a year, maybe once a quarter, you're going into this epic deployment and you're dreading it. And we've all been there. I've been there. I have lost so many of my weekends in my life and my evenings to these epic deployments. So when we talk about developer velocity and where we want to achieve, it's this continuous delivery pattern. We have this thing where we call CI/CDs, continuous integration, continuous delivery. So when we're deploying stuff continuously and delivering that code and that value continuously, we're deploying more often, but we're also deploying more small and focused changes to our code, not the big bang approach. And we're using great best practices by using code commits and automating our testing. We're creating feedback engines and having those historical records. So just like the race car, one person's not doing 4 jobs anymore. They're doing one small focused job to achieve that and be better at it. They're automating as much as they can. So looking at their tooling, they're going from that hammer to that air wrench, right? And then having that feedback engine, that's that person staying there and watching the pit stop and making sure the next pit stop is even faster and even better. So I want to talk a little bit how Microsoft made the change in our organization, because I have a lot of organizations and people that come to me that say, we are making changes. We want to embrace DevOps. We want to enable our developers. How do we do it? Now, again, the people change is the hardest thing. So I'm going to talk a little bit how we did it at Microsoft. And Microsoft is a massive organization, right? And a lot of organizations are not nearly as big as Microsoft. A lot of us work for smaller organizations or medium-sized organizations, and these principles apply throughout. So when Satya became the CEO of Microsoft, he came in and said, our mission is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And he meant it. And it meant one of the things we had to change is we had to adopt a growth mindset. So when we talk about developer velocity within our organizations, we need the ability to change and to grow. No developer wants to work on the same bit of code day in and day out without any change, learning new things, and being able to accept that maybe this way doesn't work and we want to try a new way. So every person at Microsoft has to live by this kind of mantra of adopting this growth mindset. It's moving away from a fixed pattern of thinking and saying, yeah, let's try something new. Let's, every day's a school day. That's okay. We also created a culture of customer obsession. We didn't have that before. I will fully admit it. It was well before I joined Microsoft, but Microsoft has transformed into opening themselves up to focusing on the customer and what they're delivering. And we had to take our teams and make sure each team was just delivering to shared objectives, and that was really critical. We had to change our definition of done of developers. We had to use, what is our definition of done? When a customer came to me and said, I want to deploy my application stack to the cloud, I would get a whole laundry list of things. And that's great, but we have to then divide it and say, right, what are the must-haves and what are the nice-to-haves? And we had a black and white definition of done. And if we had a time scale to deliver that in, that's what we stuck to. And we had to rip things out of the project to deliver quality, not quantity. Another thing we had to do at Microsoft was adopt a production-first mindset, meaning every bit of code we write isn't for a test environment or a development environment or pre-prod, it's for production. So we need to make sure we're testing things, and everything was, having this production-first mindset. We go from production all the way through to delivery. And the other thing we have to do is change how we collaborate and enhance our security from day one. And this is part of that shift left mentality, is enhancing the security, enhancing that productivity amongst our teams. We had to eliminate unhelpful KPIs. I mean, how many of you out there have had to estimate, how long it's going to take you to complete something? And I hate the how many hours is going to take you to complete a task, because for me, I might be able to do something in Terraform in 2 minutes. It may take someone 2 hours. I was working on a project recently, and I'm coding in C#, which is not my strongest language. It took me a day to do something that would probably take someone an hour, but I'm learning and I'm growing my skill set. And so the completed hours on a task, is so variable amongst everyone, especially if, we all come from different backgrounds, different learning environments. That's critical. And having like a bug bar and saying, right, you must find X amount of bugs in the code, or you must have this % of code coverage. If you're, taking your developers and saying you must write this amount of code and deliver that, well, you're forcing them to put in probably crap code or take out really good code that should be there. And those are really unhelpful KPIs, because again, quality over quantity. We need to measure outcomes and not outputs at Microsoft. And we had to evolve our organization, and this was tough. So a lot of organizations work in silos. You have your DBAs, you have your ops team, you have your development teams, QA, and maybe your PMs and your security team. These are all separate entities. We brought everyone together at Microsoft. So my previous title was Senior Software Engineer. That tells you nothing of what I did. I mean, really. And Cloud Advocate also doesn't really tell you what I do. But we devised feature teams, and everyone became an engineer. So instead of becoming a horizontal engineer or developer, we became vertical. So instead of being concerned about, one part of the stack, if I know data, I'm not going to, I previously would just focus on data, but my data affects other parts. Maybe it affects some API calls or how my app works, or maybe it affects something in the UI. But becoming a vertical engineer or vertical developer, I was concerned about not only my bit, but how it affects the other bits. And there it creates that kind of empathy and understanding of the full stack. So I will admit, I don't know data extremely well. So if I was working on a task in maybe, again, C# or automating something, and there was a data element to it, I had to know how it affected that data, what output it generated. And that was important. So I would use other people in my team to help broaden my skill sets, but I had to at least care about that full stack. And that was help driving that kind of product-centric mindset and that end-to-end delivery. And we had to evolve our teams. So this is prior to COVID. Everyone sat in a physical room. So there were certainly remote workers, but everyone was in the same geographical area. So for instance, everyone here in the UK is in the same time zone, so we could be on the same full stack team. And we were cross-disciplined. So my previous team, I was previously in a team that was cloud native. So I had super strong open source technologies on my team, Kubernetes, containerization, and automation. Great. If we hit an issue with, again, data, because data for me was a nemesis in my team, or maybe a super difficult security issue or something, like we weren't specialists in those areas. We had to pull in something else. And we probably missed a lot in our project as well for the customer. So then I got moved to another team that was a mishmash of different skill sets. So I had a data person, I had an ML person, I had people with very, very different backgrounds, and that made it great to collaborate and pair program with. So we did that in our engineering teams. We have in these teams, we have an engineering lead and a product owner. Now, the product owner knows the 12 to 18 month view of the project. A lot of the projects I worked on were 6-month deliverables, really tight timelines, but that product owner knew what that plan was, for when we develop products like Azure DevOps or Outlook or M365, they have a 12 to 18 month roadmap because that's the time the team's really intact. So that product owner is responsible for that. There's an engineering lead that helps lead, all the ceremonies, the sprint ceremonies that are involved. But the actual team owns everything from inception to production delivery, meaning an idea comes up on this feature. We're going to, bring up this idea. We're going to start planning it. Everyone's involved in it. They own those tasks, everything on the boards. And then when they deliver it, they're owning that in production. So when you are opening up an issue on GitHub or giving feedback to Azure on a certain product, that team is delivering not only that feature and looking at the inception of that idea, but they're owning that in production because they own that full life cycle. That really helps the team go, you know what, it's a data problem. I'm going to throw it over the fence. No, I own it because it's my product. So that was something we had to do. And these teams are self-managing. So each team has a team working agreement. They have a team charter and their own OKRs. Now, we're given OKRs from the organization that we belong to, the engineering side or what have you. But each team had a charter and goals that they owned. So they had their own kind of like culture within the team. So Microsoft has a culture, but our team has a culture. And these teams are usually intact for about 12 to 18 months. And there's probably about 20% turnover at the end of those 12 months or so, or 18 months. Engineers, developers could choose to go on to another team. Maybe they want to work on another feature because maybe they have other interests or they want to grow their technology sets. But it was really important that they own the features in that group. The whole team led it, and there was just this whole different culture change in that team. One of the other things we had to do when we talked about collaborations, we had to automate everything. We used to have really, really long running functional tests. Now, I'm going to use the product Azure DevOps as an example. It used to be a Bach product. It's now a cloud delivered product. And it took 3 years to ship the original product. And it was originally called Team Foundation Server. I don't know how many of you remember that out there, but Team Foundation Server 2005 was the first iteration of Azure DevOps, of what is known as Azure DevOps today. But it didn't ship until 2006. It took 18 months to write the code and then 18 months to deliver it. And then that was a 3-year development lifecycle for that product. As the product transpired, we got it hosted in the cloud. It went to VSTS, and now it's Azure DevOps. We started shifting to unit tests and automating these functional tests. And that was really critical. And we do that for a lot of our products. That includes Xbox, M365, Dynamics, etc. That's all delivered in that same methodology. I work more on the DevOps side, so more kind of ingratiated with the product group on Azure DevOps. But that's how we had to deliver automation and make that product better. That's why you see those updates every 3 weeks, because we're constantly looking to make those changes to those features. The other thing is all of our builds had to go green. So again, we have this production first mindset. We had to run over thousands of tests, and 100% of the pass were 100% of the tests were required to pass in order for that bit of code, once it was submitted, to go to production. So we would also have some rolling tests that would continue in production, but you had to pass the unit tests before that code could be pushed into the production branch. So basically, as soon as you push that PR. So that's a lot how we've done it at Microsoft, but I really want to focus on everyone here in the audience and talk about the developer velocity and some of the tooling that can help. So we had to make a lot of cultural changes at Microsoft. And when we go and engage with a customer, we're starting off with these best practices from day one. So we get assigned to a customer project, and that's exactly what we're doing. So any kind of external facing projects, a lot of these organizations are working with waterfall methodologies. So we go from day one and we start this with the customer, and it's tough. It sucks. So I mentioned that Azure DevOps works on a 3-week release cycle. We found that to be the best release cycle for Azure DevOps because that's our sweet spot. We call it the Goldilocks principle. For us, we tried a 4-week release cycle, but 4 weeks was too long. We couldn't really get enough out, and 2 weeks was too short. A lot of times when I'm engaging with customers, I'm working a 1-week sprint cycle, and that sucked. That was hard to take a customer that's working a waterfall methodology and say, right, we have 1-week sprints. But it literally was, lighting the irons in the fire, because you had to get on board. You had to kind of learn to manage your time a lot better. And within about the 3rd or 4th week, you started to get it. And you just had to manage your time very differently, but it really brought the customer on board. And if that flowed really well, we could move to a 2-week sprint cycle. And that's with the customer project. And it's hard, but it brought in all those components to developer velocity within the organization, in the customer's organization, to fruition in the customer project. So we talked about shifting left. We talked about doing things early and often, right? We need to build security practices into our delivery. And most developers don't want to talk about security, but we have to. We have to when we talk about cloud. We have to talk about that when we're delivering our value as developers, because it starts with the developer environment. When we talk about security, it doesn't start when we've shipped our code. It starts as soon as we've cloned that code to our machine. So when you've cloned your code, you've started that process, right? So it starts from, what are we using on our machines? What is our developer environment? I use VS Code day in and day out. There's tools like Visual Studio that I think many of you are aware of. Maybe you're using something like GitHub Code Spaces, but using whatever local IDE works best for you and your organization is critical, because that choice also could help the developer velocity conversation. I've worked with customers that use Notepad++, and I'm sure a lot of you out there still do. I remember pairing up with someone one day and I found an issue in my Terraform code, and he goes, "How'd you find that?" I was like, "Well, VS Code told me." There's so much great intelligence built into things like VS Code to help you with your syntax in your code, and that's great, right? And there's tools we can use when we commit our code to look at, code analysis and security unit tests, dependency management, and then we look into the whole CI/CD process. These tools are built in there to kind of take the burden off us as developers, but enable us to have these security practices built in. But I know security is just a topic none of us really want to really think about day in and day out. So I think everyone's pretty well aware that Microsoft acquired GitHub. Why did we acquire GitHub? Because we went to where the developers are. We know there's over 50 million developers that use GitHub, and open source isn't just about, the use of open source or technologies. We know there's a massive amount of output and value with organizations that use open source technologies. And when we start looking at not only open source technologies and an open source mindset, we create this culture of knowledge sharing and contributing to software development. When I worked in ops, God forbid someone share their code with me or how they did something. And when I moved into development, it was so refreshing. Like, "Oh yeah, I've got a project up on GitHub, go check it out. Oh yeah, or I found this on GitHub." It's this collaboration piece, which is massive. And at Microsoft, we absolutely promote that. And, that helps promote the developer velocity. Again, there's more stats on that out there. There's just so much research on it right now. So if any of you need to kind of go back to your organizations and say, right, can we have these facts and figures? We know that organizations that are delivering this value, that have higher developer velocity in their organizations, are having 4 to 5 times the amount of revenue growth and 55% higher innovation. So there's great stats and figures that we can pull out there when we go to organizations and say we need to enable our developers, and here's why. Right, we're delivering, to them it's a value, but it's also us as developers going, I can deliver more value. I really like a lot of the tooling in GitHub, so I'm going to talk about GitHub. I'm going to give everyone a demo in a minute. It's going to combine both Azure DevOps and GitHub into some cool stuff. So with GitHub, again, there's great security features built into it. I know we all hate security, but there's been so many cloud breaches, not because we've left a back door open. How many of you have kind of put a password in a plain text file somewhere hidden on a server? I've done it because we're pushing for time to get a project out the door and we're rushed and we're just going to do it. That's where a lot of the cloud breaches actually happen. So GitHub's been really good at putting in those security features, because I'm forgetful a lot. I would even dare to say maybe sometimes lazy. Like I'm writing my code and going, oh, I'm just going to push this here, and then I forget about it. It's not maybe I'm lazy. I just forget about stuff, really. But GitHub has things like CodeQL, where code's treated as data, and it scans your code as soon as it goes into that repo. Dependabot, for any of you that's seen it in GitHub, is really cool. It does dependency scanning in repos, and it opens a PR with suggested fixes and remediation. So that's really cool. And the secret scanning is a big one. Whether you're using Azure DevOps repos or GitHub for your code repos, you can scan those repos and find passwords, and it notifies the administrator when it's found. I actually was on a customer project recently, and I got a notification that in Azure DevOps, there was some dependency scanning and they found a password. I hadn't put it there. it was traced back, but we had full traceability and we caught it before it did any damage. And actually, the good news is the password that was found wasn't anything that was going to cause massive blow up. But yeah, and then we have things like GitHub Actions. GitHub Actions are awesome. How many of you, again, you can throw this in the chat channel, have used GitHub Actions? They're event and schedule driven, and this is a touchy topic. People ask, right, well, there's Azure DevOps, the product, and you have Azure Pipelines, and then there's GitHub Actions. Which one do you use? So before I go in and answer that question and tackle that little wall, actions aren't just CI/CD. So Azure Pipelines are full out CI/CD. Actions allow you to automate anything, right? That's what they're there to do. And it's not just pushing out your code with CI/CD, but you could push code to a repo and send a welcome message to someone that's joining your repo. It allows you to just do event and scheduled workflows within your system. And then GitHub code spaces are really cool. And GitHub code spaces are effectively a secure development environment. So again, we're talking security, but how many of you are, working on workstations that are completely locked down by organizations because they don't trust you? So we talked about that trust element before. That's critical to developer velocity. And maybe that they don't trust you. They don't trust everyone else around you. And that's really prohibitive to our developers, but there's ways around it. And say ways around it, we're not skirting the law or anything, but there's GitHub code spaces where we can create a containerized environment and all of our developers can be working from the same exact environment in a secure cloud location. So we have the data residency thing resolved, the code is not on their machine, and they can pick it up from anywhere. So if their machine does crash or someone steals it on the London tube, whatever, there's no code that's going to disappear with passwords or other issues, right? It gives a secure development environment. It gives control from the organization to say our developers have a sandbox, not a sandbox, but an area to work in that's completely controlled and has all that good stuff. And some of you may have heard of GitHub Copilot that came out, that was announced at Build recently. That is in preview. A little bit of there be dragons with Copilot. It's based off of GPL, a little bit controversial at the moment, but it's effectively putting an AI to help you write your code, but it's pulling from that GPL database. Again, there's other AI technologies like IntelliSense and VS Code that helps you write your code as a developer, which is really great. I'm just going to briefly touch on Azure DevOps. So, right, we have Azure, we have DevOps, the whole thing that we've been talking about, and then Azure DevOps, the product. And I've talked to you about how we've iterated this product over so many years. The reason why I talk about Azure DevOps is because I don't care what type of code you write or what you're deploying to. I don't care if you're on-prem, in Azure, GCP, or AWS. Azure DevOps allows you to deploy any language to any platform flat out. And it uses 5 components to do that. It uses Azure Boards, which is kind of like your planning area where you can put in, PMs love this area. You can put in calendars and all your boards, put in swim lanes, track and discuss all the work across your team. So you have full visibility end to end of that work that maybe you're incepting and then delivering, and then you can put alerting into it. So something in production kicks off and monitoring, you can hook that into Azure Boards, create a work item, and it's all tracked. You can track all your bugs. It's great. Then you have Azure Pipelines. Again, I've talked about this. This is our CI/CD. And then Azure Repos, which is effectively your source control. So uses Git. You can use a distributed or centralized version control. And then you have Azure Test Plans where you can do testing from and testing tools. And then Azure Artifacts that allow you to add artifacts like NPM and Maven, etc. So Azure DevOps uses these 5 components. The other thing you can do with Azure DevOps is you can hook in GitHub. So if your code's already sitting in GitHub, but your organization's like, yep, we want to totally, integrate GitHub into Azure DevOps, it's always 6 one way, half dozen the other with organizations, I think. So I'm going to tackle this because I get this as a question at every, talk I give, meetup, etc. What's the difference between GitHub Actions, and Azure DevOps, and which ones do we go for? So I'm going to tackle this one now because I think it's the right time. GitHub Actions, again, more than just CI/CD. So GitHub has been putting a massive amount of investment into its products. So Azure DevOps, again, uses these 5 components, and it's a very, very mature product. Okay, and so with the GitHub acquisition, we're enabling GitHub to do more. So if you think of it as Azure DevOps sits up here, fully fledged, fully functional, great. They're trying to build feature parity into GitHub. There's a lot of things that GitHub won't have that Azure DevOps does have. One of the biggest issues that I've had with customers when we go to go on customer projects is data residency. So it is coming. GitHub Enterprise is addressing it. But if a customer's code can't sit in the region where GitHub currently allows it, we have to go with Azure DevOps. We put our code in Azure repos because maybe the sensitivity of it, we can control what region it's in. But regardless, Active Directory is the authentication backbone to all of this. So the security side to that is absolutely fine. But everyone's talking about GitHub Actions. Like everyone is just like, oh, and GitHub does this, and yeah, you're right. But there's some things that it won't do that Azure DevOps provides. So where do you go as an organization? It depends. I can't give you a one-off answer. Azure DevOps is not going anywhere. And to kind of prove that point, I want to use an example. So when this whole session started, there was a screenshot of me doing a Channel 9 video on the DevOps Lab about static web apps. Static web apps went CI/CD in, I want to say, May this year, June. And I'm going to talk about static web apps because when you're looking at applications and moving a website to the cloud, you have all sorts of options. You have Azure web apps, you have Azure static web apps. I know naming, sorry. And then you have Azure Blob Storage static sites. So you have kind of like 3 different ways you can host your website. So when they came up with Azure static web apps, they wanted to enable their developers or all developers to take on this product with a ton of cool features. But from day one, have the ability that when you commit your code, you have full CI/CD built in and it would deploy to your website. So we talk about developer velocity. So this is an Azure product. If any of you use Azure thoroughly, maybe a little, maybe not, you're going to see a lot more of this. A lot of Azure products, you have the ability to create a pipeline potentially, look at the developer tools, and there are developer tooling. But Azure Static Web Apps, one of the first things where they said, right, we're going to enable end-to-end CI/CD with it. So I'm going to give a bit of a demo on static web apps because I think from the CI/CD perspective and developer velocity, there's some really cool stuff. So let's go into that. So I have already pre-built 2 Azure static web apps, but we're going to build one now. Okay. I'm in my Azure portal. I'm going to create a new static web app. So I do all my demos on the fly because I believe in DevOps, which means sometimes they break. So if it does, I'm sorry, but I do have a backup. So we're going to build a static web app here. We're going to create it. So I said they built in the CI/CD from day one. All right, so I'm going to build to my resource group. I'm going to call this any bytes, whatever. It's 2021. It is. I don't know. I've lost it. We have a hosting plan option. So I'm going to use the free plan. There's also a standard plan that has a few more features and functionality in it, but there's a lot of things baked in, and I'm not going to go into pricing and all this stuff. But the reason why I want to go into the plans is because it's not just a static site that you build, and it's not as heavy as an Azure web app. If you're not running a database behind it, just running static content, needs something really easy, you can bring a custom domain to it. It manages your SSL certs. Really, the standard then goes into more enterprise level, meaning like private endpoints for networking, et cetera, and more staging environments, and has a few other added benefits. So, okay, so they want to make it enterprise ready. It's pretty scalable, so we're going to deploy this in West Europe. So there's a couple cool things we can do here. So it says deployment details down here on the bottom. If I hit other, this would direct me to Azure DevOps. So if I select other there, it deploys my static web app. And when it does that, it deploys it here. So this is a static web app I've already built. Again, just for time and the ability for me to break things live and on the fly. It deploys it. I have a website here. I can click on it. I have to take a deployment token and hook it into my pipeline. So this isn't automated yet. So again, not everything's fully automated on the Azure DevOps side for this, but it's coming. So they're well aware of it. But I've effectively built a pipeline in Azure DevOps. I've built it ahead of time. And I've added the task here for my static web app. So it's a task that's fully supported, built into the portal. And they wanted to make sure that when this service came out in Azure, that this was ready to go for Azure DevOps because we have so many people asking for it. So I can click on it here, fill out the details, and put in the YAML. Now, one thing I have done, if there's any PowerShell fans out there, because I'm a big PowerShell fan, I've automated the creation of that token. So the one thing I do have to do is add that management token. It is a variable into my pipeline here. It's actually right here for me. I had to manually enter that, but I have this PowerShell script that goes and pulls that token. So again, we're going to talk security and developer velocity. And if I had to, as a developer, go chase a token every day, what happens if I'm off sick? What happens if I get hit by a bus? Or what happens if I just don't care or I forget, right? Because that's the reality. I could easily forget. I forgot my coffee this morning and I forgot to go get my token because my organization requires me to refresh that token every day. This PowerShell script actually goes and chases that token for me and adds it into my pipeline so I can read. So anytime I need to redeploy my code, it's one less thing I have to do. It's automated that for me. But that feature to automate that token refresh from Azure DevOps is coming. It's not here yet. So out of the box, we can do that. But yeah, actually, so let's go to the other route. I want to go to GitHub. So let me just go ahead and change my portal because I have multiple portals. I apologize. Let me go do this the correct way. Right, so I want to go and do this with GitHub. So we've effectively gone through the process of what it looks like if I do it with static web apps. I need to sign in with GitHub here. Just go through it here. So I'm authenticated in. And as soon as I do that, it goes, right, which organization do you want to attach to? Now, I have multiple orgs I belong to. I'm going to go into my own. I create a repository. So it sees all my GitHub repositories, all my code sitting there. I can pick that up. And I did build one for static web apps. Here we go. And then I can pick a branch. So if you're an organization that has, or you work in multiple branching strategies, so maybe you have production or, other branches in your organization, maybe 3 branching, I've worked with companies that have like a main, a pre-prod branch and a testing branch, et cetera. So you can deploy to that branch. And all I have to do is hit main, review and create. And it's reading my code that's already in that repository. So I can hit review and create now, and it will do that, and it will launch that static web app. That's great. Not here to talk about static web apps entirely. I want to focus on the cool stuff we can do when it's in the portal. So I've already built a website. Again, just did it ahead of time, just in case I break something. This is it. I built a website. It's a static site, but HTML, no big deal. As I've built that, maybe I've gotten requests from my company to change our website. Something isn't right. Maybe they don't like welcome. Maybe they want it to say happy Thursday. Yes, it's Thursday. Happy Thursday, whatever, or, add a few words into it. Great. So I'm going to actually go into GitHub. So I can do this from Azure, from VS Code, from whatever ID I want. I can use GitHub code spaces for visual purposes. I'm going to do this straight from the portal, the website. So this is my code for my website that you saw here. Okay. I'm going to go into my index here and this is what we want to change. So I'm going to go in and edit it. I'm going to pull some code from my machine. There you go. Again, you could have any reason your organization change your code. I'm going to make a pretty big change on my website. And I want to say new website. Oops. Again, when we talk about, committing changes as developers, make your code readable, make your changes readable. So I have an option here to commit directly to my main branch, which I can do. But actually, I want to create a new branch. So I'm going to just call this any bytes to match my thing so I can track it. Again, this could be my test pre-prod branch, whatever. So what it's doing is comparing my new branch to main. Okay, yep, I'm happy with it. I can put in some comments about anything. And then I create my pull request. So the reason why I want to go through this is not talk about static web apps, but as soon as I create this pull request, it's running checks. Now this is built into GitHub, and it's something when they released Azure Static Web Apps, They wanted to make sure from beginning to end as a developer, you could push your code, make your changes, and you had testing built in. So what it's doing now, it's taking my PR, running against the workflow, the GitHub Actions, and it's on every job it does that. Now, when I create a new static web app in Azure in the portal, and I went back to this piece here. I'm going to just go into another branch here, and I can set some build presets. As soon as I hit review and create in the portal, it's pulling my code for my website. It's pulling that index page and all my code out of GitHub, but it immediately creates a workflow for me. So while this is building, I actually want to go into my actions. So this workflow was built from the moment I incepted my static website here. So it creates the file for me. I can view my workflow file. So again, this is out of the box. So this is a couple cool things that static web apps do. You create it, connect to your repo, whether it's Azure DevOps or GitHub. This, I didn't have to write any YAML. So in the Azure DevOps side, I had to go pull the item out of the marketplace for static web apps, and then I had to fill it in and know where to get my code from, what's the location of my files. This does it for me. It reads my repo and goes, yep, we see your code. Yeah, here's an action. So I didn't have to write this workflow at all. And I can see that, as a build and deploy job, it sets up the job. It runs a little test. I can add tests to this. So it gives me a workflow. It gives me some basic stuff to run tests against, and I can expand on that workflow file so that anytime I create a pull request to my code, that testing is built in. So let's check in on our website. So it's still running. Should only take a couple minutes. There we go. So what it's doing is it's taking that code that I just put in my pull request. It's running the checks. It's actually deploying the static web app as we speak. And when I say it's deploying the static web app, it doesn't deploy to my production static web app. It's going to do something else. Cool. So that's gone through. That's completed. So right. So I've changed my index file on my website. I wanted to make changes because my organization told me to. Awesome. I can merge my pull request. There's no conflicts. It's run through my testing. Again, we can add more tests to it. But what's interesting is while it's done that, the GitHub bot here has added a staging site. So I've created a static web app with code that already exists in GitHub. As soon as I create it, I automatically have a workflow file created. On top of that, I've now just been given a staging site. So those of you that haven't used staging sites before, it's an exact replica of your production site, just in a different slot, if you will. So I can run full testing end to end on this. And then when this pull request is ready, I can merge this pull request and that staging site goes away. So I effectively have an exact replica of this static site. So if I click on this link here, it's going to pull up my new site. Ignore the fact that it says static web app conference. You can tell I didn't change my website. But if you look at the web address here, this is automatically generated by Azure. It has a -4 here because it's the staging slot I'm using. But it's the exact same as this. So my static site has not been affected. Code's still the same. It's still running, but I put in my test code. So what we've done for developers, and you're going to start seeing this a lot more out of a lot of the Azure products and resources, that you go in, you deploy something, it generates that YAML file for you, that workflow, that action, and puts in some tests. It gives you a baseline for your developers. It gives you that automation baseline as well. And instead of saying, I want to automate something, how do I then do it? This is built in, baked into the product. And this is why I like showing the Azure static web apps, because it's really slick, it's baked in, and we're absolutely going to see more of this. So when we talk about developer velocity, I don't want to be going to a server every day and updating an operating system. I want to get my code out there. That's important to me. So that's the demo. All right. I promised everyone a little bit of a demo. I just want to go over a cool few bits of tools real quickly, and then I'm going to open up for questions, comments, whatever. We can talk about the weather. So a lot of developer tools got announced at Build this year. We have built, and I talk about developer velocity, a whole lab around developer velocity. Some of fantastic resources that is between Microsoft and GitHub. So Microsoft and GitHub have really worked as separate entities. Our products intertwine, but from an internal perspective, they are their own company. We want to amplify what developers are doing out there. And, again, I talked about well-being and developer work, and these are all really important. So these are measuring DevOps metrics, and this is really critical because when we talk to organizations about developer velocity, how to enable your developers, this is one of the initiatives we started. There's also some cool stuff where we have the space project. Again, check it out. Go to this link, check it out. Look for the Developer Velocity Lab. There's a great amount of white papers. And this goes into a lot of different case studies and everything else for organizations. And I think there's some great stuff in there. And we're really starting to see organizations use it more and more because we need buy-in from the business. Because remember, we need that top-down buy-in. And it's all about using the right tools for the job. There are lots of options out there. And I hope, we've all been able to play with some of these or all of these at some point in time. I've been using Power Automate and Power Apps recently. Been having a lot of fun with that because it's low code. It's like using a Logic app, but kind of sort of different, but the same. Also, things that got announced at Build is .NET 6, Preview 4. Again, we want to build cross-platform applications, improving performance for customers, improving the experience for you as developers as well, and making sure that when we're developing these applications for Windows or Mac or Android, it's all supported, and this is all supported via Studio. So there's a link to the preview version. There's also some updates for Visual Studio 2019. Again, helping developers just with productivity enhancement. All these tools are thinking of the developer first. I think that's what's really critical. And a lot of these tools are integrating with, not only just Git and CI/CD, but GitHub Actions, etc. And then I think there's some really great updates for Docker containers. If any of you, again, we talked about GitHub code spaces. It's a containerized environment. So if you're working on a project with someone, you're both using Visual Studio in 2019, we can containerize that environment, and then each developer's running their tests on the exact same environment, and they're writing their code in that and running those tests locally instead of saying, well, it worked on my machine. Enabling these tools to help for the developer productivity and developer velocity. And there's a lot with Visual Studio extensions for Power Platforms. Again, I do a little bit with Power Platforms. They are low code. They're great for some easy tasks. They're great for the low hanging fruit ones. I used one the other day, literally Monday, to create a form. And from that form, it creates an Azure DevOps work item for me automatically and then sends me an email with all the information I need. So I get that notification. I can also send a notification to a Teams channel, but it's things that take, something's happened. I need to create a work item in Azure DevOps. Why? So it can be actioned. It can be prioritized. I can set the priority in Azure DevOps, and that's really cool. So the Power Platform is interesting because it also enables people that don't know code to be able to do something with code or low code, really. And again, I'm going to talk about security because it's so critical, and we want it to be a forethought in all of our projects. There's been integration with Azure Security Center into GitHub. Again, picking up vulnerabilities in pipelines and in the repos, which is super critical. So there's this, again, massive DevSecOps movement, and that's in preview currently, but will coming GA soon. So I've thrown a lot of resources at you. Again, please feel free to reach out to me at any point in time on Twitter or LinkedIn, ask questions. Email's a bit of a struggle for me, as Derek can probably understand. I get a lot of emails in a day, and but yeah, please reach out LinkedIn or Twitter. There's great resources on Channel 9. Derek mentioned the DevOps Lab, so I will a little bit of shameless self-promotion. I'm pushing the DevOps Lab this year. I recently pushed out a feedback form on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'll push it out again probably tonight. Whatever kind of topics you want to see regarding DevOps or certain technologies or processes, like fill out that form, because we're starting to shape the shows. And because I'm owning that now, I want to make that something amazing. And I'm also bringing in members of the community. So if you have a great idea, I want to hear it. Whether it gets you on the show or we can find a product group to start delivering some of that, great. There's also Microsoft Learn. So Microsoft Learn is fantastic for learning a lot of stuff, not only just Azure, but other things. There's some great little PowerShell tutorials, learning .NET, etc., and stuff in Azure. And when you're learning things through Microsoft Learn, It's free, which is awesome. There's also sandbox environments. So if you don't have access to an Azure subscription, you can spin up MS Learn, run through the tutorials, and give yourself a sandbox to play with, which is super great. And I use the sandbox. I mean, I have access to subscriptions, but I still use the sandbox because it's right there. I can play with it, and then it just goes away, which is super easy. And again, links to Developer Velocity. There's a link up here. I can share the links later with everyone as well. So yeah, I just want to thank everyone for their time. And then we're going to open up the floor for questions.
I don't have any questions specifically, but the Donovan quote I've got stuck to my laptop somewhere. It might be my old laptop now, so I didn't want to spoil it when you asked what people thought DevOps were. So yeah, it's an interesting one, like you say, but different opinions. We had Microsoft actually come into work at Sage and run a DevOps course where they went over a lot of the publishing or deploying Azure DevOps with Azure DevOps. And it was interesting, sat in a room full of developers, QA testers, engineers in general. When asked what DevOps was, there was a very mixed sort of idea. And in an actual fact, this was only about 2 years ago now, and there was some people who didn't even put their hand up when they were asked if they knew what DevOps was. So it's interesting, and it's obviously becoming more prevalent.
It is, and it's concerning everyone. I get pinged by executives a lot. I had an exec team from BHP in Australia ping me, and they're like, "We need to do more with this." It affects everyone in the company because again, they're driving that value. And you know, I've worked a lot with public sector customers in the UK, and I've worked in public sector in the US, and you're shoved in a basement. You know, you're literally shoved in a basement. I can tell you how many NHS hospitals I've been to where the poor IT team are down in a basement. And it's grim, and they're treated like third-class citizens. And yet when something breaks, everything's on fire and everyone's screaming at you. And it's starting to then drive that value to the organization. Well, actually, they're keeping the hospital running. They're doing this. They're doing all these great things. And I think that is the fight that we all have to fight. And I think when cloud comes into play, people panic. They're like, I'm not going to have a job. I've worked with a lot of people that are specialists in like storage, you know, all sorts of things, networking. And they're like, well, what am I going to do in the cloud? I'm like, you're going to automate things. You're going to start automating things and being proactive. And that's why I talked about the epic versus, you know, the massive deployment, because you're no longer going to be fighting fires and getting yelled at and having someone stand over your shoulder. You're going to be able to be proactive and do stuff that produces results for the organization. And when organizations see the value in that, it's massive, but it's a long, hard battle.
And I think for me personally as well, coming from a traditional sort of sysadmin background, it's overwhelming quickly making that transition into a more DevOps. It's the toughest part is getting started, and that's because there's so much out there, and there's so much variation that getting started is the most difficult part. And I worked for a construction company who were global, and my first foray was using DSC. So it's like infrastructure as code. Yes, right. What can we standardize? And literally the only thing in the organization, 14,000 headcount, thousands of servers. The only thing we could find was 2 DNS servers that weren't a total mess. So it just bridging that gap of getting started, and then, but once you get started, making small iterations after that becomes easier.
Yeah, and that's why in an engineering role at Microsoft, we engage in customers on a problem. We had a problem. I worked with a customer that had a physical box sitting under a desk, and it ran all their testing for their vehicles. A single box, no DR, no backup. Well, there was kind of a backup. That was a long story. But this is a large organization that makes a lot of vehicles in Germany, and they had a single box. I'm like, yeah, we need to test all our vehicle software with this. And I'm like, so it's critical, but you run it on a single box. And I think we've all been there. I've worked for large organizations in the US where, you know, there's no redundancy. But we take this project, we take this one problem point. Kind of backup is not a backup. I have a really good story of the outage that happened, and I've never seen my manager cry at the time. Kind of backup is not a backup for sure. Neither is, we think we have DR. And it's adding in these automation bits, and it's scary and it's hard, but when you pick one application stack, when you pick a problem and attack it, you're right, Brett, like it makes such a difference, and that value then gets brought back to the business, and like, look what we've done, look what we've saved, look what we can deliver. Again, a great book is The Phoenix Project, if anyone's ever read it. If you're a sysadmin developer, doesn't matter, like it touches the hearts of many. It's one of my favorite reads, and I actually have, let me find it, one of the first copies of DevOps Adoption Strategies. Martin Coupland's written it. He's based out of the UK. I literally received it yesterday. I don't know if it's any good. I'll tweet about it if it's good. If it's not good and you don't see a tweet in a week, no, just kidding. Martin's a good friend of mine, but I think, yeah, it is how to get started. I think the Phoenix Project's great and it's an easy read. But yeah, it's hard getting started. So if anyone out there watching this is like, where do we start? Like happy to have a chat, reach out. But yeah, kind of backup is not a backup. And I saw a question. Saw a lot of questions. I'm going to try and go through them. Yeah, Stephen, who said project managers live by the estimated hours for tasks all the time. I have worked in situations in Agile where estimated hours are certainly there. And again, that's a mentality change with the PMs. We used to do amount of effort, or sometimes how many cups of coffee. Again, but it's amount of effort was to you, not to someone else. And it wasn't based on hours. So we worked on a Fibonacci scale. A cup of coffee was like, yeah, I can do this in like a couple seconds. Small task, 1, 3, 5, 8, 13. And in a sprint, if anything hit 13, it was split up into smaller tasks, right? Then things weren't rolling over all the time. So the amount of effort was 8. It's going to take me the entire sprint. 5 is like 75% of the time. 3 would be, smaller, about half maybe, and then 1. And that's about where we found is our estimation principle. But yeah, PMs love estimated hours for tasks, and it's hard to break that because, again, I mean, you could be great at PowerShell and the next person could suck, but we need to build that full stack developer engineer, and people need to learn. Just because you suck at PowerShell doesn't mean you can't be awesome. Just because I suck at C# doesn't mean I can't be awesome with it one day. Maybe one day, but probably not. Yeah, and I think, Brett, you brought up tests and when you go against deadlines. And again, that's the hard part of DevOps, is saying, right, we pick this problem, let's build the tests in. And I think that's why I like the static web app demo, because it has some testing. Like we can merge our code and go, right, and then you know what? Let's add a unit test. So I like the static web app example. We've deployed a static web app. We have pretty much the whole thing automated. So we need to give our developer access via a code space or Visual Studio Code or however, or if we're doing it straight through the portal, that's fine. They have access, and it's fully traceable end to end. So we've covered off traceability in our project. We've automated the deployment. We've put in, we can put in a branching strategy if we want to. And there is a test. It's not a massively great test, but there's a test. And you can say, right, in this 2 weeks, we got that set up. In the next 2-week sprint, Brett, you're going to write a unit test. One test. Don't kill yourself. One test. And I think that's the value add with that, is we can add one test there, and we've done more than we had before. We have an automated pipeline. We have some cool stuff that's automated. But yeah, testing is always the first thing that goes. And I have shoved so many things off without tests. But if we create the test before we start writing our code, that's where, again, and you may have to, start with a test. Don't start with all the tests. And that's a hard one, because I think we go into projects and they're like, we need all this testing done now, but we don't always know what those tests are.
Well, I mean, one test is still 100% more testing than you previously had.
Exactly. See, the numbers are great.
Yeah, I find it's always the thing that gets cut first, but it's always the thing that saves you if you have it. Yeah. Absolutely.
It's kind of like, I use the example of, I'm going to use a networking specialist that I worked with, and he goes, I don't understand source control. I don't understand why I need a test. And he was changing stuff in a spreadsheet, and he was changing IP addresses, submitted his change, record it in the spreadsheet manually, fat fingered a number. There was an outage we had in Azure. Again, it's probably like 2.5 years ago now, but it was a big one. It was like one all the customers knew about. We had a storage outage. Someone fat fingered something. So not everything at Microsoft is automated, but someone fat-fingered something, and like I can't even type my name correctly. So this is why I automate everything. I have no hope, but it's those little things that, you know, even if you're just changing one IP address, I've seen people bring down entire systems. So yeah. Yeah, Stephen, you don't hate security. I think a lot of people do. They cringe. But again, it's bringing that security person in early on. You know, shifting left here. More PowerShell next time. Yeah, Brett, and you haven't used Codespaces yet. Codespaces is interesting because it's been in preview. So it was Visual Studio Codespaces initially, because at Microsoft we love changing the names. I am in no way, shape, or form in charge of changing names. So I'm glad that's not my job, because that would not be a good job for me. So yeah, it was Visual Studio Codespaces. So it emulated Visual Studio Code. Cool. Then it's now GitHub Codespaces. So it's hosted in GitHub, but it still sits on Azure. They work the same effectively. You're buying consumption. So for those of you that haven't used Codespaces, you're spinning up a dev container on Azure and you pick your CPU usage. So maybe you want like 8 gigs of RAM, 2 CPU, and maybe you want a Windows OS or Linux. It doesn't matter. It's a dev container. It really becomes irrelevant, but there's pricing differences. You can set it to automatically shut off after inactivity for 30 minutes. So let's say, yep, I walk away from my machine to go get a cup of coffee, and yeah, I'll be away for 30 minutes because I've had 2 cups of coffee and an entire pack of biscuits. True story. So that timeout saves the company money, right? And then I can maybe have like a machine that has like 2 CPU and 4 gigs of RAM, but then I need to spruce it up when I have more. Maybe I've written all the tests, Brett, right? Maybe. And so I can beef up that dev container and run the tests from that. And again, it's an isolated environment. It's fully secured and locked down. It uses Active Directory authentication. And it's a really, really cool thing. I used it with customers. So if any of you in the UK have heard of the OpenHack program, it's free. It was hosted by CSE, the organization I used to belong to, and it's free technical workshops. They tend to offer a lot to customers. There is a website, if you use your favorite search engine and look up Microsoft OpenHack. They run events all through the UK. They are going to be remote, obviously, still. They might go in person eventually, but we have guidance to run everything remotely still. And it's free, but you have to bring your own device. So when we work with organizations that are so locked down, people spend a day getting their environment set up. Like, oh, I need to get VS Code set up, especially if you're doing like the containers OpenHack and you're like, yeah, I don't work in VS Code, or I don't know how to do any of these things. If you do it in dev container, it's prepackaged, ready to go, and it's not running on your machine. So a lot of times I see people with machines that are not running enough resources to run anything locally. And again, if I'm writing my code on my machine and I have a Windows OS and my colleague's running it on a Linux or a Mac machine, we're not testing against the same thing. So that dev container lets us have that same environment. So that whole "it worked on my machine" argument goes away, right? And then when we deploy it to wherever it's going, we have that consistency. And Ian has a question. Do you have anything about the Microsoft DevOps certification? So AZ400. Yes. So good news and bad news about that. It's a fairly easy exam if you use Azure DevOps. Now the renewal is 1 year. I had to take the renewal. So when I took the initial exam, I had to have like everything off my desk, nothing behind me, and they're like watching you like a hawk, which is fun. So I took that, passed that. I just did my renewal like a couple weeks ago, and it's like 40 questions, and I had 100 browser tabs open. So I may have used a few search things. They've updated what they're asking for in the exam. There's a website for the AZ400 exam. MS Learn has free content. Definitely utilize that. Again, it's free. And the content is updated against the exam. It won't be 100%, but it's pretty darn close. There's also lots of resource learning guides out there. Again, selfish promotion. I did a series on Channel 9 about Azure learning resources, and it talks about all the places you can learn about Azure stuff from. And we have the OpenHack program on there talking about OpenHack resources. We have GitHub on there, LinkedIn Learning, etc. So, I mean, start at Microsoft Learn. When you look at the exam, go to it. There's also some people that posted some stuff on Twitter, etc. My colleague Jay Gordon is writing some stuff now for the exam. It's not out yet, but look at MS Learn and have a hack at it. And don't worry, that's only valid for 1 year because the renewal is like, I think it was like 30, 40 questions, and you could have other browser tabs open. I swear I didn't look anything up.
Renewal's free as well, isn't it now?
Yeah, it is free. Renewals are free. So before you had to pay for it and it was a pain in the tail. Now it's free. So if you need to get the exam for work and if you can expense it, even better. But yeah, the renewal is free. So you just pop in, you click the button, and it takes you to the website. You don't have to have a proctor. You don't have to book it in. You can do it at your own convenience. I think I even took a Teams call for work in the middle of my exam retake. By the way, don't share that part of the recording with anyone from Microsoft. Stephen, you asked, how would you recommend as an organization to get started with DevOps and automated deployments? Again, if you can pick a technology stack that you think, or an application stack, a problem, and start there. So I showed the static web app thing. That's a cool way. And when it comes to automating deployments, the static web app thing is great because it's built in. Most deployments you're doing from Azure aren't necessarily automated from day one. So make the decisions are right for your organization. Are you going to use things like infrastructure as code? What type of infrastructure as code? Are you going to go Pulumi, Terraform, Bicep, or ARM, or some other flavor of something else? But pick an application stack, pick that problem. And again, define your definition of done, because as soon as you automate one thing or do one thing, you're like, oh, I could do this. So really prioritize what you want to achieve in that. So again, pick that problem stack, define your definition of done, and take these resources that we've kind of talked about, how we define the team, the engineering team, full stack team, beginning to end, own the inception of that idea as a team, deliver it as a team, and find the tools that work great for you as a team. And let's say that's Azure DevOps, utilize Azure boards, do all the tracking, do your planning in there, have your ceremonies, start with those basic things, and really, really start getting to go with that. But I mean, again, it's that one big problem. And that's where my old team got brought in a lot, was what's something we're trying to solve. Again, there's a physical box under the desk. We need to do something with this. And we ended up turning that into a VM in the cloud. And we did it in stages. So the first stage was the first definition done was getting that that physical box as a virtual machine into Azure. And that sounds easy. The physical box had a Windows side of it and a Linux box. And they actually both had to run at the same time. So it was virtualized on that physical box. The virtual machines had to rely on each other to run. There was like a timestamp in the application, and they had to be exact, or within like half a second or a second. So we got them into VMs, and then we picked apart the application, and then we started automating things. And the customer was ecstatic when we built a VM. And something I want you to keep in mind when you're implementing DevOps is celebrate even the little milestones. For you all that are out there, and maybe you work in Azure day to day and you're like, yeah, it's a VM, whatever. I build VMs all day. That's a big step. And I remember working with this customer, and they were celebrating, and the other people on my team were like, it's a VM, what's the big deal? And I'm like, hold on, guys. They had a physical box under the desk. They now have a virtual machine. It has backup. It has redundancy, and it's working, and they can scale it. Like, it wasn't really, really scalable, but it was partially scalable. So I really had to focus that with the team, like that. Let's celebrate that. The customer was super ecstatic. So that was a milestone. Then the next milestone for that customer was we started scaling that. So that went to a VM scale set, and that was our just scaled out the VM across the scale set. And then we added all sorts of automation. So we had Terraform deploying the entire environment, and we had a fully secure, a pretty darn secure environment from day one. We had testing there, and that was kind of the next 3 months or so of the project, was that scalability. And we had other technical issues to overcome as well. So it sounds like it's easy. I mean, we had issues on licensing on hard-coded MAC addresses. We had issues on networking implementation with Terraform, but also how VM scale sets work and how we had to access Key Vault. We secured all our passwords in Key Vault. So there's lots of things that went on, and that's why it took the 3 months. But we said 6 months, we built a VM scale set and fully automate everything end to end. So when the customer needed that box, that server, they pushed a button, it deployed the Terraform code, it built a VM scale set for Windows and Linux VMs. The whole system fully scaled. So instead of one person running a simulation in 12 hours, you could have 300 developers running simulations in 2 to 3 minutes. So that scalability had a massive impact on the organization. So iteration 3 went a step further, and they containerized that environment and used Kubernetes as the control plane to scale it even further and have a much smaller footprint. So we went from a physical server under the desk collecting dust. Took 12 hours to run a simulation with one developer at a time. 300 developers could then run simulations in a couple minutes, and it could fully scale. It was backed up. It was redundant. So when we talk about not really a backup, there were backups of the VMs because we kind of had to for posterity's sake for the organization. But because we had full automation on our code, if something broke, we just redeployed the environment. It deployed it all out into a new resource group, net new, and the storage stayed the same. So the storage never went anywhere. And the VMs just pull from that storage and go, right, okay, my VM's broke. That's fine. I'll just spin up a new resource group with all the VMs I need. And they fully scaled out. So that was more of our DR plan than our backup plan, but it was faster to do that than restore backup on a VM, even in a scale set. So we just had to change how the organization thought of it. We had to leverage the technologies that were there, and we automated everything. And it took 6 months to build this. And just keep that in mind when you're starting with DevOps. Just pick something attainable, and pick the must-haves versus the nice-to-haves. Another one from Steven. Biggest problem with being good at infrastructure is no one knows that you are good at infrastructure because it doesn't break, or when it does, no one notices. Yes. It's called the meddling fingers. Well, we've called it the meddling at Microsoft. We call it the meddling fingers. A bit of an Americanism. Meddling, when you go and play with something and touch it. And it's kind of one of those things where I'll sit and talk to a customer and be like, right, if you didn't touch the server for a day, would it still run? And they're like, yeah. Okay, well, how about a week? They're like, yeah. I'm like, okay, if you didn't touch this server or this environment for a month, would it still run? And they're like, no. And then I'm like, how about a year? And I have gotten people that say, yeah, I could not touch my application stack for a year and still run. The problem is it is invisible because you're not tracing your work. There's no visibility to it. So you need to give yourself visibility. And this is something that's big on, even developer velocity. Right, I wrote some code. How do they know I wrote that code? Well, by checking in and making a commit, they see those changes, and I can go to my manager and say, yeah, I made this change. So that's good because if I break something, I can revert my change, or someone else broke something, we can point the finger in a very nice way. The problem is with infrastructure, there isn't usually, not a lot of people have full logging in their environment. Some do. Some have things like Splunk installed in their environments, or one of the other VMware products, and they have end-to-end to say, right, this person logged in, but we can't always see what they changed. Splunk sometimes picks some of them up, sometimes it doesn't. So by using things like the source control piece, if we can automate it, we have traceability. And that's the hard part in infrastructure, saying, well, I just go and push this button. Well, how do we automate it? And it's kind of also a joke that you spend 20 hours automating something that takes seconds to do every day. But I hate to use this phrase, Stephen, but it's totally true. It's the what if scenario. What if you got hit by a bus? And please don't get hit by a bus. But it's happened to me. I had a colleague, he ran the SharePoint environment, died on a bank holiday weekend. I came into work on the Tuesday, and my manager's like, right, you're managing SharePoint. And I was managing the infrastructure. That's cool. Then I had to actually manage the whole SharePoint environment that serviced about 220 stores. How do you do that? Yeah, so I had to learn a lot of things. Good, you don't bust us there. That's good. Well, don't get hit by cars or kites or foxes. Just stay healthy. But it's true. Things happen. Or people take holiday, right? How can we afford to take holiday? So it's being able to find ways to make your work traceable, and prove that value and that worth to the organization. Yeah, don't win the lottery. Hey, I would still work if I won the lottery. I just potentially work from a boat in the middle of the ocean.
I think one of the things you touched on actually in the start of the presentation, and also back to the point you've just made about knowing where to start. For us as a software company, we started with releases because they were the most painful. But I think if you're not a software company, it's actually more difficult to figure out where to start. So if you're an internal IT team that you're not shipping software, a lot of the content and a lot of the DevOps stuff is software related. So applying the same principles to an internal IT org is slightly different. But I think that comes back to the bit you touched on with the value stream mapping. You didn't call it that, but effectively sit down. Don't you sit down, get somebody high up to sit down and go over a process and find out what the most painful point of that is, and then automate that. Yeah. And we did. I used to work for OpenText, big company that does printing stuff effectively, and we did that. I mean, we were shipping software as well, but one of the VPs sat down and mapped out an entire customer journey and found out where the pain points were, and then that got us to concentrate on those. And the benefit of that, you don't just automate a painful process. They're generally the most time consuming, so you get that time back to then go and do other things. Whereas previously you've got somebody, I don't know, working 3 days a week doing this particular task. That's now 3 days you can go and have parties or do whatever you want to do with that time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's people fear losing their jobs, especially when, and I've had this with so many customers. You walk in, you're like, let's talk cloud, and it's amazing, and people are like, there's my job out the window. It's scary, but I say this, I got into tech because it's cool, it's fun, it's interesting, it changes. If I wanted to be a boring human being, I would be an accountant, and I'm sorry if anyone's an accountant or their partners are accountants. To me, accountancy, I'd rather shoot myself in the face. I do not want to be an accountant. Like, it's numbers. I love numbers, but numbers don't change, and tax laws change and things. I don't care. Like, no, for me, that's not what I love. I got into tech because things change and technology excites me, and I like doing cool things. And I like to think that most people got into tech for that reason, right? We like to make a difference, and when the tech makes a difference, it makes us feel good. We drive that value, and it means adopting a little bit to the industry. What is the industry doing? And it is hard to keep up with what the industry is doing. And every customer I go into, they're like, we're so far behind, because they see this awesome, cool, shiny thing we talk about, and like, yeah, we're not there yet. And most organizations aren't, but it's that continuously evolving thing and acknowledging that and saying, we need to do better. How do we do better? But it is hard to find the time. And I'm writing a series on Git for ops people. That's not the official title. I have no idea. I haven't titled it. Someone else is gonna have to be really creative and do that for me. But the whole premise is ops teams don't have time to learn Git. And ops teams, when it comes to DevOps, if I'm honest, have the hardest job, because they're maintaining infrastructure, they're fighting the fires, and I don't have time for this, because if I don't keep this infrastructure up, I'm out of job, right? And I really want to tackle this series because I think it's something that's near and dear to my heart, something I've lived, and I still see so many organizations in that place. Like, I just don't have time, and they walk out of the room. Literally, I've seen customers walk out of the room because they don't want to spend the time, or they're literally off dealing with a storage issue. So how do we help them deal with those issues? If you're constantly having storage issues every day, why are you having storage issues every day? And it's an important topic. So that's one I'm building, and I'm actually using a live group of humans to run the course against and to run the series against, because they don't have time. And they're like, why do we need to use source control? We'll figure it out. So yeah, we're gonna run this series live. It should be really cool.
I did a talk at the UK PowerShell conference called Git for Ops People 2 years ago for exactly the same thing. Yeah. Such a painful process. I think Derek was going to say something, actually. Derek, were you going to say something?
Yeah, sorry. No, I was just remembering something I did years ago. I joined a company where they didn't have an install process. Again, delivering internal software, but it would take someone a week to configure, and it was COM objects and God knows what, and then I just kind of went, yeah, this is insane. And it probably took me, 2 days to write an installer, but then the installer was, 10 minutes every time you want to install it, and people just couldn't believe it, It was like, wow, this is amazing. this is automation. This is amazing. You know, it's strange, even low technology kind of stuff. You know.
I used to work for a UK MSP, and I won't name the name, but I'm sure if anyone looks through my history on LinkedIn, they can find it. And before they made an acquisition, anytime a customer wanted a server, it was 4 days. And I'm like, I built a lot of servers in my time. I was a solution architect at the time. And I'm like, why does it take 4 days? Oh, well, it has to go through plan. Like, we have to plan it. And then they had physical pieces of paper. They had to go through a checklist and do. And someone had to manually deploy it. Like, so we have an image built, yet it takes 4 days to get a customer server up. So if customer wanted a server, it was 4 days. This company made an acquisition, and that process I think improved, but I left because I couldn't stand the 4-day deployment. I'm like, how do you have an image built? It still takes 4 days, but it justified the job and it justified the cost. And what's interesting is, well, if we still charge the customer whatever that was to deploy that server, if we automate it, frees up that resource to do something else with their time, like deploy more servers and deliver more services for our customers, or, you know, yeah, it's interesting. It's hard to find the time, but it's such a critical thing. So
I think as well, it harks back to internal IT organizations being a cost center, and the fact that it was like, well, we can't charge other departments if we're doing things quickly, and rather than enabling the business, that they're there to serve the business, and so they treat them like a customer, and it's like a black box that nobody's allowed to see into.
People are very protective, and I think this is one thing I don't talk about in this talk, and similar to you, Brett, I do like an infrastructure as code talk, and it's pets versus cattle. So again, anyone that's been in system admin or just in general, like, we feed and water our servers. Like, I used to name I've been to so many customers that have naming conventions, and when I say naming conventions, not just like a generic naming convention. Like, I worked for a customer in Boston that had all their servers had names of beers and like barbecue food. So like every type of like local beer was a server name. I worked for a company where all the name of the 14,000-foot mountains in Colorado were like certain types of servers. Like, a lot of thought, right? This is the pets mentality. We feed and water our servers. We feed them every day, whatever it is. We go in there, we log in, we check on them. And then when we move to infrastructure as code and DevOps, we have to think of it as cattle. We're herding cattle. You know, we create a naming convention and create like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, or however our organization wants to name our servers or our resources. And it's a cattle mentality. Like, don't get attached to it. If any of you work with containers or you know, any kind of automated process, like, you just don't get attached to it. You know, I've had so many things break with like Kubernetes, you know, running like Docker containers. I just blow it out of the water and deploy it again in a matter of minutes. And it's such a different mentality, and it's okay. It's okay to let go of feeding your pets. I mean, that's why we have dogs and cats, and we then leave our servers to be our cattle. But yeah, it's changing a lot of mentality, and it's tough. It's really tough, especially if you've built an environment up over time. There's a lot of work that goes into it. It's hard to let that go, but you know, there's a point where you don't want to be meddling into the servers every day. You want to move on and do some cool stuff.
Cool. Don't think there's any other questions in chat. I should probably go and make sure my tea is not burning. I've been kicked out of the room upstairs, and I think I've been in 5 different rooms now so far. So thank you very much, April, for that talk. That's good.
Thanks, April.
I don't think we've got anyone lined up yet for next month. So if anyone does want to speak, or maybe in the meeting now, give us a shout. Or if you want to say any specific topics, get in touch with me or Derek, and then we can get something scheduled in. I've got 2 weeks off, my first actual holiday this year, so I might actually get some time in to schedule some talks for the rest of the year.
Cool. I'll get this this video put up on our YouTube channel as well, and I'll tweet that out when that happens. So, all right. Well, thanks everyone for attending, and we'll hopefully see you next month. And thanks very much, April.
Thank you, everyone.
Cheers, April.